Amy's eyes wandered from her book to look out the high windows of the living room. Nothing was there, just snowflakes lightly falling through the sky. Still, Amy shivered. She felt uneasy and a little scared all alone in the Morgans' big house. Little Isabel, the baby, was sound asleep in her nursery upstairs. Amy almost wished the baby would wake back up. At least there would be human sounds in the house to keep her company. She tried to keep her attention on the history book she was reading. Her teacher had warned the class that there might be a quiz on Monday morning, but it was difficult to concentrate, and Amy's eyes kept wandering off the page to look out into the dark night. She must have gone into a daze, staring out the window at the lightly falling snowflakes, because suddenly, every muscle in her body jumped when she heard the sound of the front door opening. Amy listened to the click of the latch and then the slight creak of the heavy door as it moved. She even felt a cold draft move through the living room just as she heard the door shutting again. "Mrs. Morgan?" she called out in a frightened voice. "Mr. Morgan?" There was no answer. Only dead silence in the big house. Amy felt her heart begin to pound. Could it have been the wind that pushed the door open and closed again? Or was someone in the house? Amy shrank into a ball on the couch. She was suddenly too afraid to move. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps were moving across the hallway toward the staircase. "Who's there?" Amy called out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps slowly climbing the stairs to the second floor. Amy was so afraid now that she felt sick. She sat on the couch, listening to the footsteps climb up one step after another, higher and higher on the staircase. Then, through the panic clogging her mind, she remembered the baby, Isabel. Amy knew she couldn't just hide from the footsteps. She had to make sure the baby was all right. Standing up on trembling legs, Amy began to creep quietly across the living room toward the hallway. Just as she peeked around the corner of the doorway, she heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs and begin to move across the upstairs floor. Then they stopped. Amy froze where she stood. Terrible thoughts flew through her mind. She knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to go up and check on Isabel. She pushed the thought of the footsteps out of her mind and raced up the staircase as fast as she could climb the steps. Her heart was pounding, and her breath came in short gasps by the time she got to the top. Several lights were turned on in the hallway, and Amy searched every doorway and corner, but she saw no one there. Quickly, she dashed to the doorway of Isabel's room and flicked on the light. The room was empty except for the baby, who was cuddled in one corner of her crib, sound asleep. Amy strained her ears. There was no sound except for Isabel's light breathing. No footsteps, not a hint of danger. For a second, Amy wondered if it had all been her imagination. Had she even heard the front door open at all? Had she really heard footsteps on the stairs? Maybe she had fallen asleep and it was all part of a bad dream. Amy looked at the baby one more time and then turned off the light. She tried to walk slowly down the hallway to the stairs, but halfway there she began to run, and she scrambled down the stairs so fast she almost fell. Finally, she ran into the living room and jumped back onto the sofa, curling her feet underneath her. She felt as though she just had a terrible nightmare, but now it was over. With trembling hands, Amy picked up her book again, but a second later, she heard the sound. The sound of the footsteps. They were coming back down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Amy wanted to scream, but her throat had gone dry and tight. She listened to the footsteps get louder and louder as they came closer and closer to the hallway. In horror, she turned to look through the doorway to the staircase. The footsteps sounded as if they had just reached the bottom of the steps and were coming across the hallway toward her, but she could see nothing. Nothing at all. Amy fixed her eyes on that terrifying, empty space where the footsteps had stopped. Just at the doorway to the living room where she sat, for several agonizing moments, there was silence. Then the footsteps turned away and walked toward the front door. The door latch clicked, and once again, the solid wooden door swung open. Amy heard the heavy footsteps walk outside. Then the door shut, and the house was filled with silence. Slowly, Amy stood up and began to walk toward the front door. She walked over to the place at the doorway where the footsteps had waited. Then she went to the front door and slowly, carefully opened it. The snow was swirling down in big, thick flakes now. She looked down at the sidewalk. In the snow, she saw large, deep footprints walking away from the house. Tomas liked to walk with his grandfather in the high windswept hills that surrounded the small town where he lived. The hills were cut into odd shapes by the wind that had been blowing over them for more centuries than Tomas could imagine. His grandfather told Tomas about the ancient peoples who lived in the hills and were probably still buried there. Tomas listened to his grandfather's stories, but he didn't believe all of them, especially the ones about the dead people. Tomas wasn't the least bit superstitious, and his grandfather's stories were full of warnings about ghosts and evil spirits. One day, Tomas went out walking in the hills by himself. His grandfather wasn't feeling well because his legs were stiff and ached. Tomas promised to bring back a special plant that helped cure the aching. It grew wild in the fields where him and his grandfather often took their walks. Tomas set off from the town on a trail that wound up through the reddish-brown soil into the mountains. He decided to go visit the sheltered, cave-like hollows that the wind had carved into one of the hills many centuries ago. As he walked, he was surprised to find so many rocks fallen on the trail. He remembered hearing the wind last night when it woke him from a deep sleep. But the storm must have been much worse than he realized to have loosened so much dirt and rock from the mountain. Tomas walked on, keeping an eye out for the plant that he promised to bring his grandfather, but he remembered that it grew much higher on the mountain, close to where the hollows were. As he climbed up the trail, Tomas hugged his jacket tighter around his body. The wind was still blowing hard, and it cut through his clothes like a knife. Tomas started to run to stay warm. Soon he came to an overlook and stopped to rest. Below him in the valley, Tomas saw his town. It looked so small and unimportant from where he stood. And suddenly, Tomas felt small and unimportant too, all alone on the mountain. He shivered and thought about turning around and running back home. But he remembered the plant that he'd promised to get his grandfather and started back up the mountain trail. A short time later, Tomas came to the place where another small trail led off toward the hollowed-out caves in the side of the mountain. He could see that the windstorm had been even stronger here. Loose soil and rock were blown into piles where they'd never been before. Finally, Tomas reached the base of one of the hollows, like a dark mouth carved into the side of the mountain. He began to climb up a steep rise to its entrance, but halfway up, he came to a sudden stop. Right in front of him on the trail was a white object. It was so white that it seemed to be shining in the sun. Tomas stared at it in disbelief. He'd climbed this rise many times with his grandfather, but he'd never seen this skull before. Tomas stepped up to the skull and bent down on his knees to study it. The skull lay looking back at him with its empty eyes and grinning teeth. Tomas reached down to pick it up, and just as he touched the hard, smooth bone, he remembered his grandfather's words. Never disturb the rest of the dead. For a moment, Tomas almost dropped the skull. He could still hear the warning note in his grandfather's voice. But now the skull was in his hands, and he wanted to keep it. He could hide it on the bottom shelf of his bedroom closet, and when his friends came over, he could show it to them. No one else he knew had a human skull. The skull grinned up at him as Tomas carried it away from the mountain. He knew that the rest of the skeleton had to be buried somewhere nearby, and the grave had been disturbed by the storm the night before. But now, the skull was his, and after all, whomever it belonged to was long, long dead. When Tomas came near his house, he pushed the skull under his jacket and hurried into his room to hide it. Then he came out to talk to his grandfather, who sat rocking in a chair by the big living room window. The moment he met his grandfather's eyes, he remembered the plant he had promised to bring. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I forgot the plant, but I'll go back and get it if you want," Tomas stuttered, suddenly feeling as though everything he'd done was wrong. His grandfather told him it was too late for the day, but maybe tomorrow he could go back for the plant. Tomas agreed and then went back to his room. He looked again at the skull, grinning out at him from its hiding place. Suddenly, Tomas wished he had never brought it home. He threw a sweater over top of it and shut the closet door. That night, the wind began to howl again. Tomas went to bed early, after his parents had gone out and his grandfather started telling stories again. Tomas did not want to hear the stories, so he lied and said he didn't feel well. But when he laid down in bed, it didn't seem to be a lie anymore. He didn't feel well. His body was shivery and his stomach ached, and the thought of the skull in the closet filled his mind with uneasy dread. Finally, he couldn't stand to just lie in the dark anymore and think about that skull. He got up, turned on the lights, and opened his closet door. He picked up the sweater he'd thrown over it and saw the skull sitting there, just where he left it, still grinning at him, but now the grin seemed to have an evil edge to it. Tomas slammed the closet door and ran back to his bed, flicking off the light and covering his head with the blanket. After tossing and turning for more than an hour, he fell asleep at last. Tomas wasn't sure what woke him hours later in the middle of the night. Maybe it was the wind still howling outside, or maybe it was the aching feeling in his stomach. But whatever it was made him sit straight up in his bed. He sat there, feeling a shiver travel through his whole body from head to toe. Then he noticed the strange smell in the room, the smell of something old and dead. And as he sat there in the dark, shaking, Tomas heard a strange sound. It was the sound of things that were smooth and hard, clicking against each other. With trembling hands, Tomas reached over and turned on his light. Standing at the end of his bed was a headless skeleton, its long, bony arms reaching out, searching for something. Then, from inside his closet, Tomas heard a weird voice.
"Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones."
Tomas shrank down in the bed. He watched as the white skeleton moved around his room, grasping out with bony fingers. The legs stalked over to where he lay, and the cold, bony fingers touched his feet. And still from the closet came the voice.
"Give me back my bones. Give me back my bones."
Then, the bony fingers of the skeleton moved up to Tomas's head and felt his eyes and nose and lips. Fear choked Tomas's voice as he lay there, unable to scream, waiting for the skeleton to take its revenge. But the voice from the closet called out even louder.
"Give me back my bones."
Suddenly, Tomas jumped from the bed and ran to the closet. He opened the door and reached down to pick up the cold white skull. Its hollow sockets looked up at him, and its grinning teeth began to move.
Give me back my bones.
With shaking hands, he carried the skull to the skeleton and placed it on top of its neck. The skull turned its face to him and grinned once more. Then the skeleton walked out of Tomas's room. The next morning, Tomas woke with an awful headache. He rubbed his eyes in the morning sun and suddenly remembered the terrible dream he'd had. He jumped out of his bed and ran to the closet, and he searched and searched, but the grinning skull was gone. The 4 young boys had been canoeing for 5 days in the wilderness, and they were hungry, sore, and totally exhausted. Their guide, Jake, kept pushing them on. There was another portage just ahead. "I don't think I can make it," Ty said in a weary voice. He shared a canoe with Ron. Ron didn't say anything. He just kept paddling. As usual, their canoe was lagging behind the other 2. Ahead in the next canoe, Pete was working hard to keep up with his older brother Phil. He didn't want to look like a sissy in front of Phil, especially after he persuaded him to take him and his friends on this canoe trip. In the lead canoe, Jake paddled on with his smooth, strong strokes. This canoe was shared with Eric, who tried to do everything exactly as Jake did. As their canoe glided within a few feet of the land, Jake leapt out into the water. Eric followed him a few seconds later. They guided the boat onto the shore and then pulled it out of the lake, watching for sharp rocks in the shallow water. Several minutes later, Phil and Pete went through the same process. The 4 of them waited for Ty and Ron to come to shore. It wasn't unusual for them to have to wait. Ty and Ron were always 5 to 10 minutes behind. "Get a move on it, you 2, Jake called out. "You're slowing us down." Jake liked to push on as fast as he could. The canoe skimmed into the shoreline. Ron jumped out into the water to guide it in. In the back, Ty struggled awkwardly to leap off the boat. He jumped into the water and lost his footing. While Ron pulled the boat up onto the land, Ty floundered around in the water. Finally, he waded out, totally drenched. The others laughed at him. "You'll make a perfect target for mosquitoes," Jake said. "At least you're good for something." Eric laughed his high, whining laugh. He always laughed loudest at Jake's jokes. "Let's go," Phil said, hoisting their canoe on his shoulders. Jake and Ron carried the other 2 canoes. Pete, Eric, and Ty carried the supplies. The portage was a long one. Jake said it would take over an hour. The 6 of them tramped through the spongy undergrowth of the woods. The water squished in their leather boots with each step. They had all pulled down their mosquito nets to cover their faces and necks, but their hands and forearms were unprotected. The black northern mosquitoes buzzed around their bodies, thirsty for blood. It wasn't so bad for the supply carriers. They could slap the bugs away. But carrying the canoes required a tight grip of both hands. Jake cursed as he watched the welts rise on his arms. Ty stumbled along way behind the rest, stopping every few yards to swat away the mosquitoes that circled his body in a swarm. "Look over there," Phil yelled. "In the crook of that tree. It's a goonie bird nest." Everyone looked in the direction Phil's arm was pointing. There was a huge nest with large gray eggs in it. Goonie bird eggs. "Okay, guys, it won't be the last time you see a goonie bird nest. Let's keep going," Jake ordered, without breaking his stride. They continued the rest of the portage in silence. When they came to the next lake, Jake pushed his canoe into the water and Eric loaded in the supplies. "I thought we were going to have lunch now," Ty complained in the whimpering voice the others had grown to hate. "At the next portage," Jake said without consulting anyone else. "I'm starving too," Ron said under his breath. But he pushed the canoe out into the lake, trying to catch up with the others who were already out ahead. The 3 canoes moved out over the blue, clear water. There was no conversation. Each person was either lost in his thoughts or too worn out by his physical exertion. The air was still. Then, the silence was broken. The hoarse, croaking call of the Goonie bird echoed over the lake. Seconds later, a huge bird dove down from the sky like a kamikaze bomber. Its body shot into the water, not more than 20 feet from the last canoe. "That one came close," Ty whispered to Ron. He didn't like the Goonie birds. In fact, he was afraid of them. The 2 boys watched for the Goonie bird to reappear. It took over a minute. Then it resurfaced, several yards away from where it had entered the water. A silver fish was clamped in its strong beak. The 6 canoeists watched as it took flight again. 10 minutes later, another hoarse croak came from the sky. It was loud, incredibly loud. Everyone looked up, and even Jake couldn't believe his eyes. "That's the biggest Goonie bird I've ever seen," he exclaimed. No one took his eyes from the bird. Its body straightened like an arrow, ready for the dive. When it hit the water, waves rippled out that slammed against the canoes. "A bird like that could kill you if it wanted to," Phil said in a quiet voice. Pete looked around to Ty and Ron. He had the same scared look on his face that they did. The Goonie bird resurfaced farther away from their canoes, but they could see its prey wriggling desperately in its beak. No more Goonie birds dove around them on the lake. They reached the next portage. After getting an okay from Jake, they pulled out the squashed loaves of bread and peanut butter and jelly from their packs. It wasn't much, as hungry as they were, but they couldn't eat a lot until the evening meal, when they made camp. The 6 sat silently, wolfing down their sandwiches. Ty finished first. He reached for more bread, and Jake grabbed his arm as his hand went into the wrapper. "You've had your share for today. This food has to get us all the way back to base camp." Ty withdrew his hand. Jake's grip had left marks on his arm. The others started talking about the day's journey as Ty sat alone, feeling sorry for himself. "You've been in this part before, haven't you, Jake?" Eric asked. Jake said arrogantly, "Not where we're going today." "But I thought you said," Phil began. I know, I told you we'd go the regular route. But I've done that a million times. I thought I had a good group here." He stopped and snickered. "That was before I found out about Ty." Then he continued his explanation. "Anyway, I decided last week that I'd go somewhere new. Somewhere that canoe parties don't go to." "Great," Pete said without enthusiasm. He was too tired to feel adventurous. Phil stood up. "Let's get moving then." He felt a little worried. He had hired Jake, and he was responsible for everyone else. But as long as Jake knew where he was going. They started the portage. Jake took the lead canoe again, but this time Pete and Ty shouldered the canoes while Phil and Ron and Eric carried the supplies. Eric broke a trail through the woods, directed by Jake. "Hey, look at this!" Eric called out after they had been walking for 20 minutes. The rest of them came to a halt around Eric. He had found another Goonie bird nest. and it was filled by 2 pearly gray eggs. But these eggs were unlike the others they had seen. They were huge, too huge almost to belong to the same kind of bird. "I want to go back," Ty whimpered. The huge eggs had set his imagination wild. In his mind, all he could see was the giant bird swooping down on him. Eric laughed. "What's wrong with you, Ty? You scared of eggs?" Eric walked over to the nest and took his walking stick and poked at it. "Leave them alone, Eric," Phil ordered. But Eric was looking at Jake to see what Jake thought, and Jake was smiling at him. Eric took the stick in both hands and raised it high in the air. Then he drove it down, like a stake, first into one of the Goonie bird eggs, and then into the other. The group watched him do it in hushed silence. Then, high above them in the trees, there was a rustle of wings. An agonized cry pierced through the stillness of the woods. It continued on and on like an eerie death wail. Circling above them in the sky, a giant Goonie bird swooped up and down above the treetops. Ty was shaking. Tears were running down his cheeks. Everyone else had turned pale, and even Jake looked uneasy. Eric threw the stick on the ground by the nest and ran back to join the others. "Let's get out of here," Jake said. They moved through the woods, traveling fast, but they couldn't escape the croaking of the Goonie bird. It continued to shriek in the sky. Hurriedly, they shoved off into the next lake at the end of the portage. Each of them was filled with a strange sense of guilt and fear, and even foreboding. On the lake, they automatically fell into a fast paddle. It was as though they were racing against something. Jake and Eric's canoe cut through the water in a straight, smooth line. Phil and Pete followed close behind. Ron and Ty struggled to keep up. After 2 hours of paddling, they were behind, so far behind that they were barely in sight of the other 2 canoes. "Come on," Ron said nervously to Ty. "Hurry it up." "I'm trying," Ty panted. "I'm trying." But they couldn't narrow the gap between them and the others, and they began to feel almost abandoned. "You don't think Jake would leave us out here, do you?" Ty asked. "Sure, Jake would," Ron answered. "But Phil wouldn't." Then they stopped talking. In the sky above them, they heard the flapping of strong wings against the air. Just before it began its dive, the giant Goonie bird screamed out its eerie call. The 4 in the other canoes stopped paddling and turned around. They saw a huge Goonie bird diving down, straight down onto Ty and Ron's canoe. Its body was pointing like a finger at them. They saw Ty cowering low, and Ron desperately trying to turn the canoe with his paddle. At the last second, Ron swung the boat to one side. The Goonie bird plunged into the water 2 feet away. A wave of water almost swamped the canoe, and Ty started screaming. The other 2 canoes had turned around and were coming toward them. The Goonie bird surfaced 20 feet away and then took off again into the air. But it had no fish in its beak. "Ty, shut up," Jake ordered. Ty stopped wailing and stared blankly at Jake. "We stay together from now on," Jake said. Then he swung his canoe around and started off across the lake. "Are you crazy, Jake?" Phil yelled after him. "We need to turn back." Jake kept paddling. "I said let's stay together. If you don't get moving, I'll leave you here." The 3 canoes moved out across the lake. Ron and Ty paddled mechanically. They couldn't let themselves think of the bird. They couldn't let themselves think at all. For 2 more hours they pushed on. This was a big lake, and Jake headed them to its furthest point. Finally, they touched shore on a small island. They pulled their canoes up and waited for Jake's orders. "We'll head in a ways and see if we can find a decent place to camp." The 6 shouldered the canoes and supplies and tramped into the interior of the woods. After 10 minutes of walking, they came to a clearing, but what they saw made them stop short. No one said a word. No one knew what to say. It was a deserted campsite. 2 tents were pitched. A cooking kettle hung over a burnt-out fire. Camping equipment sat around the clearing. It looked as though the people had just disappeared, leaving everything behind. "I want to get out of here," Ron said. Wait a minute," Jake repeated as the other 5 started to go back in the direction from which they came. "Let's check it out," Jake said as he walked over to the campfire. The others sat down the canoes and supplies and walked cautiously over to join Jake. "Look," Pete said, pointing to some food. "It's only a few days old." Phil kicked a loaf of bread. Insects scurried out of it. "Why do you think they left?" Ron asked. No one answered, but each of them, in his head, was thinking of a terrible reason. "I don't see how they could have left," Phil said. "I mean, you can't just leave all your supplies out here in the middle of nowhere and then expect to—" His voice trailed off. He didn't finish what he was thinking. "They didn't even take their sleeping bags," Eric said, coming out of one of the tents. "Everything is set up for them to go to bed, but they didn't, I guess." "Come on, guys, let's get out of here," Ty pleaded. Jake looked over at Ty's scared face, and he laughed. "We're not going anywhere. We're camping here tonight." A chorus of 5 voices spoke over each other, protesting what Jake had just said. "No, we're not. I want to get out of here. This place scares me." But Jake had made up his mind. "Pitch the tents," he ordered. No one, not even Phil, felt secure enough to contradict Jake. Jake was the guide. He was supposed to know this country and these woods. He was the only leader that they had. They pitched their 3 tents across the clearing from the 2 empty tents. Jake insisted that they use the same campfire. By the time they were all set up for the night, the sky had begun to grow dark. Jake lit the sticks of wood he had carefully built up. The wood burst into flame, the yellow tips of fire licking up at the dark night. The 6 of them sat around the fire, eating their daily quota of beans, bacon, and stew. There wasn't much conversation. They were all starving, and their minds were on something they didn't want to talk about. The night grew darker. Above the high black shadows of the trees, the moon shone in the sky. The campfire was like a beacon light, shining up from the dark woods. They sat around the fire, still, even though the food had long been eaten. Jake got up from the circle and went down to the lake. The others sat huddled together. "You think we'll be okay, Phil?" Pete asked his brother. "Sure, Pete." Phil wanted to give some reassurance, some strength. But he felt the same ominous fear that he saw in the others' faces. "We'll be okay," Ty whispered. High above them, high up above the towering trees, came the flapping of giant wings. They looked up. The Goonie bird passed under the moon. Its black shadow was silhouetted in the moon's silvery light. It began to dive. The beak was aimed toward the campfire's beacon of light. The beady eyes were fixed upon the circle of bodies in the large clearing. It swooped down on them, making its hoarse call of beckoning to the other giant Goonie birds. It came down in a great swoop over Ty's body, and its strong beak clamped around his neck. Then Ty was pulled upwards, his arms and legs flailing in the wind. The other giant Goonie birds came. 5 more giant Goonie birds swooped down for their prey, and moonlight streamed down on the still, deserted campsite. In the late summer, just before school started, Ellen always went to the Ohio State Fair with her friends. This year, she set off for the state capitol early one hot summer morning with her friends Jane and Diane. They laughed and talked all the way to Columbus on the 2-hour trip. Arriving at the fair, they joined the crowd of people circling the dusty midway lined with food stands, rides, and other amusements. By late afternoon, the 3 of them were tired and a little bored. They had seen nothing new from last year. Still, they decided to walk around the midway just one more time. They passed the ice cream and hot dog and waffle stands. They looked over the Ferris wheel, the Wild Mouse, and all the other rides again. And they walked by the freak show advertisements, showing the bearded lady, the conjoined twins, and the man with a rubber mouth. Then they passed a small passageway they hadn't noticed before. Ellen suggested they follow it and see what was at the end. The passage twisted around behind the canvas tents until it ended at a huge sign advertising something called the Tunnel of Terror. The sign showed a small boat traveling along a dark canal. Along one side of the canal was a scene with wax figures, showing someone being guillotined in the French Revolution. "Creepy," Jane said. "I wouldn't go in there." Ellen wasn't sure what put the idea into her head, but suddenly, she wanted to ride the Tunnel of Terror. Maybe it was that the tunnel looked cool, and she was weary of the searing heat of the midway. Or maybe it was that she was looking for something new in her life, any new experience that could be strange and different. "Anybody dare me to go in?" she asked. "Are you crazy?" Diane said. "I dare you," Jane said. "All right, I'll go," Ellen announced bravely. "I suppose you 2 are afraid." "We'll pay your way, right, Diane?" Jane said. "But wild horses couldn't drag me in there." The 3 walked up to the ticket booth. A grizzled old man sat in it, cleaning his fingernails with a penknife. "1, please," Ellen said. "You're going in alone, are you?" the old man asked, staring at her through his bushy eyebrows. "I'm not afraid," Ellen said. "Where do I catch the boat?" The old man motioned her behind the ticket booth. As she went around, Diane and Jane started to follow. "No," the old man said. "You can't go any further. You didn't buy tickets." Ellen tried to sound cheerful as she yelled goodbye to her friends, but the boat was old and creaking, and she shivered as she slipped into the moldy leather seat. The old man pulled a wooden handle beside the canal that started a gear in motion. Ellen was startled by the noise and turned around to look at him. His mouth was set in a wide grin that showed his dirty, decaying teeth. Then, suddenly, she saw nothing. The boat had glided into pitch-black darkness. In the dark, Ellen noticed that her sense of hearing had become very keen. There was the creaking drag of the boat along the canal. There was the slobbering lap of the water against the sides of the boat. Then there was a shriek that made her heart jump to her throat. A second after the shriek, a spotlight flashed on. 2 feet in front of the boat was a man stretched out on a torture rack, his arms tearing from their sockets. Ellen could see the red blood oozing from his skin. She closed her eyes and buried her face in her hands. How much longer would this last? The boat jerked around a sharp turn. Then the shriek Ellen heard was her own. A slimy mass had just passed over her face. She crouched down in the boat, feeling sick to her stomach. If she could stay like this until the trip was over, maybe she could stand it. Why did she ever want to come in here, she asked herself. She would give anything to be out in the bright sunlight with her friends. There was a rumbling sound in front of her. Then Ellen heard the sharp hit of metal against wood. She peeked from between her hands. It was the guillotine scene. A bloody head rolled from the victim's shoulders into a bucket next to the guillotine's sharp blade. She braced herself for the next scene as the boat took another sickening, sharp turn. She felt something wet, something furry, slip around her shoulders. She tried to contain her screams. It would go away, she told herself, just like the slimy mass before. But the wet fur seemed to press closer to her. She felt a weight get into the boat beside her. She screamed and screamed and screamed. Outside, Jane and Diane were laughing about the noises coming from inside the tunnel of terror. They could see the old man was enjoying it too. He leered at them, with a strange grin on his face. But then, the noise from the tunnel of terror seemed to change. The screaming became constant, taking on a shrill tone of madness. The two girls looked at each other uneasily. Jane walked up to the old man's ticket booth. "Will she be coming out soon?" she asked him.
"Few more minutes,"
he answered, still grinning.
"Getting her money's worth, ain't she?"
Jane walked back to where Diane stood at the end of the canal. "I don't like it. I wish she would come out." Just then, the air was split with a cry of terror so awful, the two girls shuddered at the sound of it. "Get her out of there," Jane said, running up to the man.
"Nothing I can do,"
he said. The screaming went on in the tunnel. It was hysterical now. Then a louder sound pierced the air. An announcement was being made over the intercom of the fairgrounds. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is important that you stay calm and don't panic. A gorilla has escaped from the zoo. Please find a safe place to wait until it has been recaptured. Do not go anywhere alone. Let me repeat again, do not panic." But the announcement came too late for Ellen. Her friends watched as she glided out of the tunnel, the gorilla sitting on the seat beside her. They quickly got Ellen out of the boat, and, miraculously, she was unharmed. Except for her mind, that is.